a wedding shrouded in secrets, and veils that hide more than faces. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your voices make this journey unforgettable. It was in the early spring of 1889 that I first heard of the singular affair which came to be known, in the newspapers of the day, as the case of the bride with two veils. The matter was destined to perplex Scotland Yard most grievously, and I might never have been drawn into its curious folds had it not been for the summons that arrived at Baker Street on a chill and fog-bound morning. London lay under a heavy mist, the kind which muffled the rattle of carriage wheels and turned every gas lamp into a pale halo. I had risen early and was engaged with my medical journals when the sharp peal of the bell at our lodgings announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson ushered in none other than Inspector Lestrade, his wiry frame and anxious expression betraying a man sorely tested by circumstance. Holmes, who had been lounging in his armchair in a dressing gown of faded crimson, raised his eyes from the chemical monograph he had been perusing. With that peculiar half-smile of his, which was equal parts amusement and superiority, he greeted the inspector. "You look like a man with two riddles and only one solution." "Lestrade," said Holmes, motioning him to the hearth. "Pray sit down. The fog will find its way into your bones if you stand much longer." Lestrade wasted little time. "Holmes, it's an extraordinary case? Most extraordinary. A wedding this very morning at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The groom, a respectable barrister, stood waiting at the altar. The bride entered, nothing amiss there, save that when she lifted her veil, another veil lay beneath it. And beneath that veil was not the lady expected. I confess I gasped aloud. "You mean to say another woman stood in her place?" "Precisely, Doctor," said Lestrade grimly. The congregation in uproar, the groom near collapse, and the real bride nowhere to be found. The impostor vanished in the confusion. Scotland Yard is at its wit's end. I have orders from above to secure Holmes's assistance. Holmes leaned back, his long fingers steepled. His eyes gleamed with that cold fire which told me he was already weaving threads invisible to ordinary minds. "A bride with two veils," he murmured, most theatrical. Deception doubled upon deception. "Pray, Lestrade, what more can you tell me of the missing lady and the intruder who dared to usurp her place?" Lestrade shook his head. "We know precious little. The groom swears he scarcely glimpsed the woman's features, so sudden was the outcry. As for the true bride, Miss Clara Whitcomb, she has disappeared without a trace." Holmes rose abruptly and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson. The air promises to be brisk, and our friend Lestrade has offered us a puzzle which cannot be solved from the comfort of an armchair. The stage is Westminster, the hour propitious. Let us see what shadows linger beneath the veils." And with that, we found ourselves once more at the threshold of a mystery, one that promised to test even Holmes' matchless powers of deduction. Would you like me to continue in Section 2, Case Introduction, where Holmes and Watson discuss the peculiarities of the incident on their way to Westminster, including one of Holmes's trademark unrelated but dazzling deductions? The cab rattled through the mist-laden streets as Holmes, Lestrade, and I made our way toward Westminster. The inspector sat stiffly opposite us, his hat pressed low over his brow, as though to shield himself from both the chill air and the weight of his own perplexity. Holmes, by contrast, leaned with apparent languor against the cushions, his eyes half closed, yet I knew from long acquaintance that his mind was in feverish activity, turning the affair over and over with the restless energy of a hound scenting quarry. "You have told us, Lestrade," Holmes began at last, "that Miss Clara Whitcomb vanished entirely. Yet vanishings are but tricks of perception. No woman of flesh and blood dissolves into the London fog without leaving some trace: carriage wheels, footprints, servants' recollections. You have inquired into her movements prior to the ceremony?" "We have," said Lestrade. "Miss Whitcomb left her father's house in the company of two maids and her coachman. They swear she entered the church in her bridal gown. The ladies of her party remember assisting her with the veil. But when the moment of unveiling came, it was not she. I tell you, Holmes, the thing borders on witchcraft." Holmes permitted himself a faint smile. "Witchcraft, my dear fellow, is but ignorance dressed in superstition. Someone contrived to exchange the lady for another. The question is not if it was done, but how. And once we know the manner, the motive shall follow with the inevitability of dawn after darkness. I could not help but exclaim. But Holmes, to smuggle another woman into the very procession, before hundreds of eyes, seems impossible. Holmes tapped my knee with the ivory head of his cane. Not impossible, Watson, merely improbable to the untrained imagination. Mark me, the most successful disguises are those executed in plain sight. Recall our adventure with Miss Irene Adler and the figure of the youth in the street. Appearances may deceive a throng more easily than they deceive one solitary observer. The trick lies in confidence, timing, and a grain of audacity. At this he fell silent, and I knew better than to press him. He would speak when the edifice of deduction stood firm upon its foundations. The cab turned into the broad thoroughfare leading to St. Margaret's, and soon the ancient church loomed before us, its Gothic facade rising ghost-like through the fog. Within we found the place still unsettled. A few guests lingered in the pews, their whispers echoing against the stone. The scent of trampled flowers hung in the air. Near the altar, a young man, pale as parchment and with trembling hands, was speaking with a clergyman. Lestrade introduced him as Mr. Edward Fairchild, the forsaken bridegroom. Holmes advanced at once, bowing with unusual gravity. "Pray accept my sympathy, sir. Your ordeal must be distressing in the extreme. Yet, if we are to recover your bride, I must trouble you with certain questions." "Ask what you will," said Fairchild hoarsely. "Only find her. God help me, only find her." Holmes studied him keenly. "You say you scarcely glimpsed the impostor's face?" "Indeed." When the veil was lifted, there was a moment of confusion. The congregation gasped, I myself reeled, and she fled before I could grasp her. I only recall dark eyes and a resolute expression, quite unlike Clara's gentle features. Holmes inclined his head. "And had Miss Whitcomb any known enemies? Any reason to fear abduction?" The young man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There was one, an Italian fellow who plagued her with attentions. A Signor Luca, but her father forbade him the house months ago." Holmes's eyes gleamed, though his tone remained even. "Interesting. And this morning? Did you observe aught unusual in the church before the ceremony?" Fairchild shook his head. "Nothing, save that the pews were unusually crowded, and several strangers among them." "Ah," said Holmes softly, as though confirming some private calculation. He turned suddenly upon Lestrade. "Inspector, I require a list of all those present, with particular note of those unknown to the family. Also see that the vestry is searched for discarded garments. Our impostor must have entered as one person and departed as another. Watson, let us examine the bride's chamber." We were conducted to a small robing room behind the chancel, where Miss Whitcomb had been attired before the service. The place bore evidence of hasty departure. Ribbons scattered on the floor, a glove fallen by the mirror, and upon the dressing table, a half-drained glass of water. Holmes's hawk-like gaze swept the chamber. He stooped to pick up the glove, turning it delicately between finger and thumb. Left hand, size small, of good kid leather. Observe, Watson, the faint smear along the palm. Not rouge, no, more like a cosmetic preparation. He touched it to his lips, then nodded. Grease paint. Our impostor's mask has slipped, at least metaphorically. At this revelation, Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh. "You mean to tell me the woman wore paint to alter her complexion?" "Preposterous!" "Not in the least," Holmes retorted. "The theater supplies 100 disguises for 1 coin. And who is so practiced in deception as an actress? The very veil was but a curtain. The stage, this sacred aisle." He cast a glance toward me, his eyes alight with triumph. "You see, Watson, the thing grows clearer. A bride disappears, another takes her place, yet both cannot have passed the same door without crossing paths. Therefore there is a passage known to one and not the other. Let us discover it, and the veils will fall away of their own accord." And with that, he began pacing the narrow chamber, tapping the paneling with his cane, his whole frame vibrating with the thrill of pursuit, while I stood amazed at the speed with which a baffling enigma had already begun to yield beneath his relentless scrutiny. Holmes's cane produced a dull succession of thuds as it struck the oak paneling, each note measured with the precision of a metronome. Suddenly, the sound altered. A hollow resonance answered his tap. He stooped instantly, his long fingers probing along the carved molding until they found a tiny notch cunningly hidden in the grain. With a deft pressure, a section of the wainscot swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow passage that plunged into darkness. "Aha!" Holmes exclaimed, his face alight with that fierce intellectual joy which danger itself could scarcely dim. The theater, as I suspected, had its trapdoor here as well. Observe, Lestrade, the secret by which a bride is spirited away beneath the very noses of her attendants. The impostor slips in at the vestry, the true lady is withdrawn through this passage, and in the confusion of laces and veils, one emerges for the other. It is simple as the exchange of masks in a masquerade. Lestrade gaped at the aperture. By heaven, Holmes, who would have guessed it? This must lead to some cloister or adjoining yard. We shall send men through at once. Holmes raised a restraining hand. Softly, Inspector. The birds have flown, yet the nest may hold some feather to guide us. He snatched a candle from the table, lit it, and ducked into the opening. I followed close behind, though the narrowness compelled me to stoop, and Lestrade muttered darkly as he brought up the rear. The air within was damp and stale, the stone walls sweating with age, and the passage twisted downward in a spiral fashion, like the throat of some subterranean beast. After a few yards, Holmes halted, lowering his light to the ground. "Do you note these marks, Watson? The smear of mud, the delicate trace of a heel with a narrow waist, a woman's step beyond question, and beside it, the heavier tread of a man. The impostor was not alone. The notion of accomplices lent the affair a darker hue. Then the disappearance was premeditated, I said, a conspiracy rather than a mere imposture." Holmes smiled grimly. "Indeed, and one executed with audacity. Consider, Watson, to substitute another woman at the altar requires rehearsal, confidence, and a motive of some weight. Fortune, revenge, or fear. One of these lies at the root, which we shall presently learn." We pressed on until the passage terminated in a grated door that opened into a small yard behind the church. Holmes examined the lock with interest. "Forced recently, but from within. The lady and her captors departed here, perhaps to a waiting conveyance. Lestrade, set your men to inquire of the neighbors if any carriage was observed about this hour." The inspector departed reluctantly, leaving Holmes and me to scour the yard. Amid the mud and scattered refuse, Holmes stooped and plucked something from the ground. He held it up between thumb and forefinger, a torn fragment of ivory lace, delicate and unmistakably part of a bridal gown. "Miss Whitcomb struggled," he said softly, "and in her struggle left us this token. Brave girl." He pocketed the scrap with unusual tenderness, then turned briskly toward the street. "Come, Watson, we must speak with the father. A parent's testimony will give us the temper of the household, and perhaps the motive of those who sought to part bride from groom." We found Mr. Whitcomb at his residence, a handsome house in Bloomsbury, besieged by curious visitors and frantic servants. The poor gentleman, gray-haired and distraught, received us in his study, where papers lay strewn as though he had sought some comfort in work, but found none. "My daughter, my poor Clara." He groaned, grasping Holmes's hand with desperate intensity. "They tell me she has been stolen from the very altar." "My God, what villainy is this?" Holmes seated himself opposite and fixed the man with that calm, penetrating gaze which stripped away evasions as the sun strips mist. "Mr. Whitcomb, your daughter's welfare is our utmost concern. You must be frank with me. Has she been threatened? Did she ever confide any fear or hint at reluctance to the match?" The father hesitated, then spoke with visible effort. "There was a man, an Italian, Luca by name, who haunted her steps. A fellow of charm, no doubt, but no standing. Clara feared him, though he vowed eternal devotion. I had him turned from the door. Beyond that, she seemed happy, most happy to wed Mr. Fairchild. No shadow lay upon her spirits." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet, Mr. Whitcomb, love, whether requited or no, has driven many a desperate scheme. You will oblige me by giving me every particular of this Luca, his residence, his habits, his associates." Whitcomb provided what little he knew, adding that the man was believed to lodge in Soho among his countrymen. Holmes listened with rapt attention, his fingers drumming the arm of his chair. At length he rose. "We must follow this thread, slender though it seems. Watson, Lestrade will join us presently, but we shall not wait. Soho will be our next stage, and there, I suspect, we shall find players rehearsing for a darker drama than Westminster has yet seen." The prospect of plunging into that labyrinth of foreign cafes and dingy lodging houses filled me with foreboding. But Holmes's manner admitted no delay. Already the lines of the puzzle were sharpening, and though the final picture remained obscure, I sensed that the first true step had been taken toward its revelation. The fog had thickened by the time we reached Soho, curling like ghostly fingers around the gas lamps and dimming even the glow of shop windows. The narrow streets bustled with a motley crowd of hawkers, idlers, and immigrants whose tongues chattered in half a dozen languages. Holmes walked with his customary long stride, his keen gaze darting from doorway to window as though each held a secret he alone could decipher. I confess that I found the district oppressive, its alleys steeped in shadows and its houses leaning together as though conspiring against the very sky. Holmes paused before a dingy cafe, its signboard lettered in faded Italian script. From within came the clink of glasses and the strains of a mandolin. He drew me aside. "This, Watson, is a gathering place for Luca's countrymen. If the fellow lurks in London still, his trail will cross this threshold." Without another word, he pushed the door and entered. The cafe was dimly lit, the air heavy with tobacco smoke and the aroma of strong coffee. Rough tables were scattered about, occupied by men whose swarthy features and rapid gestures marked them as foreigners. Conversation faltered as we stepped in, and more than one suspicious eye turned upon us. Holmes, however, moved with perfect assurance, bowing slightly to the proprietor behind the counter. "A glass of Chianti, if you please," he said, his accent faultless. To my astonishment, he conversed in fluent Italian, inquiring after business and the arrival of a new shipment of wines. The man's wariness softened, and soon Holmes had steered the talk toward lodgers and acquaintances. It was not long before the name of Luca arose, spoken with a mixture of disdain and grudging admiration. "Luca?" the proprietor repeated. "Yes, he was here last evening. A fiery young man, always talking of his passions and his plans. But he has not shown himself today. He keeps a room above the cobbler's on Dean Street. That is all I know." Holmes thanked him gravely, finished his wine with deliberate leisure, and we departed without arousing further notice. In the street he turned to me, his eyes alight. "You see, Watson? Already the thread tightens. If Luca was present last night, he may be absent today for no innocent reason. Come, we shall call upon his lodgings. We shall call upon his lodgings. Dean Street lay but a short walk away. The cobbler's shop stood on the ground floor of a decaying building, its windows thick with dust. Above, a narrow staircase rose to the lodgings. Holmes mounted swiftly, and we were met by a slatternly landlady who regarded us with suspicion until Holmes produced a card and spoke with quiet authority. "We seek Signor Luca. Is he within?" The woman shook her head. "He left early this morning before the bells of St. Margaret's. Said he had business in Westminster. He has not returned." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did he depart alone?" The landlady hesitated, then admitted, "No, a lady was with him. She wore a veil, and I thought it queer, for she kept her face hidden. They left in haste." My heart quickened at this disclosure, but Holmes betrayed no surprise. He merely asked to see Luca's room, and after some grumbling, she led us to a chamber on the second floor. It was small and poorly furnished, the bed unmade, the air close with stale perfume and tobacco. Holmes moved about like a bloodhound, his fingers brushing the mantel, the writing desk, the floorboards. He paused at the table where a candle had burned low, its wax dripping over a scrap of torn paper. With a swift gesture, he caught it up, smoothing it against his palm. It bore a few words in a woman's delicate hand. "Fear not. Tonight we shall be free." The signature was absent, but the intimacy of the tone left little doubt that the note was meant for Luca. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "So, Watson, the lady was no unwilling captive, but rather a willing conspirator, or so appearances suggest." Yet appearances may be crafted as deftly as stage paint. We must not leap to conclusions. He searched further and soon uncovered, from beneath the bed, a trunk half-packed with garments and theatrical costumes, a domino cloak, a false beard, rouge pots, and veils of various colors. Among them lay a length of ivory satin, its embroidery identical to the fragment Holmes had found in the churchyard. He held it aloft with a quiet satisfaction. Behold the wardrobe of deception. Our impostor is not merely an adventuress, but one well-versed in the art of disguise. The stage once more intrudes upon the altar. Watson, I suspect we are dealing with an actress, or one trained as such. At that moment, Lestrade burst in, his face flushed with exertion. Holmes! We've traced a cab that stood waiting near the churchyard. The driver swears he carried 2 passengers, a gentleman and a veiled lady, to the very end of this street. The description tallies with your Italian and his companion. Holmes folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Excellent, Inspector. You have confirmed what we have already discovered. The question now is, whither have they fled from here? Their flight cannot be aimless. No, there is a scheme, a destination, a prize at stake. He tapped the scrap of paper thoughtfully. Tonight we shall be free. Freedom from what, Watson? From a father's authority? From an unwanted betrothal? Or from the law itself? Until we answer that, the bride remains behind her second veil. The words hung in the air, charged with menace and mystery, as Holmes's gaze drifted to the darkened window. I felt, with a certainty that chilled my very marrow, that the true heart of the case lay still concealed, waiting only for Holmes's relentless logic to drag it into the light. Holmes remained at the window for some moments, his lean profile etched against the dim glow of the street lamps, as though he sought to divine from the fog itself the course of the fugitive's flight. At length he turned, his manner brisk. We have dallied long enough here. The costumes and the note tell us what they wish us to believe, that Miss Whitcomb abandoned altar and honor alike for this Luca. But I cannot reconcile that with the signs of struggle in the church passage, nor with the girl's known character. No, Watson, the play is subtler. She may be pawn rather than partner. Lestrade, impatient as ever, struck the table with his fist. Then let us issue a warrant and sweep Soho until we find the pair. The yard will soon flush them. Holmes smiled faintly. You would scatter pigeons by beating the bushes, Inspector. Better to let them fly home to roost and then take them with ease. No, a warrant will only drive them deeper. We must anticipate their next act. He held up the scrap of writing. Tonight we shall be free. Clearly some arrangement awaited them after the ceremony, money, passage, or both. I think it likely we shall find the clue among the foreign colonies' channels of escape. Where better to vanish than by ship? A berth under assumed names, a swift departure down the Thames, and London hears of them no more. Then you think they mean to leave England? I asked. I do, said Holmes, his eyes gleaming. Luca has the boldness of his race, but little means. Such an elopement requires funds and accomplices. We must learn who supplies them. Watson, recall the theatrical costumes. This impostor is no amateur. She is trained upon the stage. The company of actors in Leicester Square, the Argus Theatre, has lately employed Italians, has it not? I read of a touring troupe in the Times last month. It would be strange indeed if our mysterious veiled lady were not among their number. Without further parley, he led us from the house and hailed a cab. We rattled toward Leicester Square, the gas lamps flaring in and out of view through the mist. Holmes sat absorbed, his fingers pressed together, his lips moving in some silent calculation. Lestrade muttered now and then of warrants and constables, but Holmes paid him no heed. I knew the signs. The great engine of his intellect was whirring, and we could but wait until it delivered its verdict. The Argus Theatre loomed before us, its facade gaudy with peeling posters that promised melodrama and opera. Though the hour was late, light spilled from the side entrance, and the sound of laughter and voices drifted into the street. Holmes dismissed the cab and strode forward with the air of a man who owned the place. He produced a card, whispered a word to the doorkeeper, and in another moment we were within, threading through corridors that reeked of grease paint and lamp oil. The green room was a chaos of costumes, actors, and discarded wigs. Holmes glanced once about, then fixed upon a tall woman who sat before a mirror, removing her stage paint with deliberate strokes. Her profile was handsome, her eyes dark and calculating. At Holmes's approach, she stiffened ever so slightly, then smiled with a practiced ease. "You intrude upon a lady's toilet, sir," she said in accented English. Holmes bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "Forgive me, madam. I intrude only upon a conspirator's conscience. You played your role well this morning at St. Margaret's." The audience gasped in admiration. "But I regret to inform you the curtain has not yet fallen." Her hand faltered, the sponge clattering to the floor. "I do not understand you," she said, though the color drained from her cheeks. "On the contrary," Holmes replied softly, "you understand me perfectly." "Where is Clara Whitcomb?" At this, Lestrade stepped forward with the authority of the law. "Answer, woman, or by heaven I'll see you in the cells before midnight." The actress, there was no doubt of her profession now, rose to her feet, her manner proud, though her eyes darted with unease. "I know nothing of your English bride. I am paid to act, nothing more. A man came. He offered money for a part to be played. I performed it. That is all." Holmes's voice grew cold. "A part in which a woman's future, perhaps her life, hangs in the balance." "Who was this man?" She bit her lip, hesitating. At last she whispered, "Luca. He said the lady was willing, that it was but to spare her shame of breaking the betrothal openly." "I swear I believed it no crime." Holmes regarded her steadily. "Whether you believed or not, you shall tell us what you know." "Where did he go, and with whom?" Her hands twisted in agitation. "He spoke of the docks, of a ship sailing tonight. The Sultana, bound for Naples. He said all would be finished once they were aboard." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me, then turned on his heel. "Come, Watson. Inspector, rouse your men. If we would save Miss Whitcomb from a fate worse than disgrace, we must reach the docks before midnight. The third veil is lifting, and I fear the vision beneath will be darker than any we have yet seen. We hurried back into the fog-shrouded streets, the hour late, the stakes higher than ever, and I knew that the chase had entered its most perilous stage. The cab wheels splashed through the wet stones as we drove with all haste toward the docks. Holmes leaning forward like a greyhound, straining at the leash. The fog had grown thicker still, rolling off the Thames in heavy coils that muffled sound and blurred the outlines of warehouses and moored vessels. The air reeked of tar, salt, and coal smoke, and the cries of stevedores rang faint and hollow through the gloom. Lestrade, with 2 constables in tow, followed close in another cab. His determination evident, though I feared his heavy hand might blunder where delicacy was required. Holmes had fallen into one of his trances, his eyes gleaming with inward light. "Consider, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rattle of the wheels. "Luca has secured the aid of an actress for his deception, arranged a cab at the very hour of the ceremony, and spoken of freedom aboard a ship bound for Naples. Does this bear the marks of a reckless suitor eloping with his beloved? No, it is the work of a man who plots like a chess player, calculating every move. And yet one factor remains uncertain: Clara Whitcomb's role. Is she willing accomplice or unwilling pawn? I ventured that the torn lace in the churchyard spoke of resistance rather than consent. Holmes nodded. "Just so. That scrap of satin is worth more than a dozen protestations. I fear, therefore, that the lady is in grave danger, for a woman held against her will becomes a liability. If Luca means to spirit her out of the country, it is not to wed her but to use her as lever or hostage." "What is the lever?" "That, my dear Watson, is the heart of the riddle." The cab drew up at the wharf, where lanterns flickered in the fog, and the hulking shadow of a steamship loomed against the murky river. A sign upon the gangway identified her as the Sultana. Holmes stepped lightly onto the boards, pausing to observe the bustle of sailors loading cargo under the watch of a gruff officer. The inspector caught up, barking orders to his men, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "Patience, Lestrade. To storm a ship in ignorance is to scatter the quarry. Let us first confirm the presence of our fugitives." He moved swiftly along the quay, scanning faces with hawk-like intensity. Presently, he drew me into the shadow of a stack of crates and pointed. Through the drifting fog, I discerned a man of lithe build, his dark hair and restless movements marking him unmistakably as a foreigner. At his side walked a veiled woman, her posture rigid, her steps reluctant. A sailor carrying a trunk followed at their heels. Even from a distance, something in the droop of her shoulders, the way her gloved hand trembled against the rail, told me it was Clara Whitcomb. Holmes's lips tightened. There is our answer. She is compelled, not consenting. The man guards her too closely, and the veil is her prison. Watson, we must act with precision. Lestrade, position your men at the gangway. I shall intercept them before they board. Watson, keep close at my side. We emerged from the shadows just as Luca reached the foot of the gangway. Holmes stepped squarely into his path, his tall figure blocking the way with quiet authority. Signor Luca, your performance at St. Margaret's was bold, but the play ends here. Release the lady, the Italian started, his eyes flashing with sudden fury. You meddle in what is no concern of yours. She comes of her own will. Stand aside! He made to push past, but Holmes caught his arm in a grip of steel. The veiled woman gave a muffled cry. Courage, Miss Whitcomb, Holmes said gently. You are safe now. He tore back the veil, revealing a pale face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with desperate relief. She clutched his sleeve as though it were a lifeline. Luca, realizing the trap, uttered an oath and reached inside his coat, but before he could draw the blade that glinted there, Lestrade and his men closed in. A brief struggle ensued, the Italian fighting like a cornered wolf. But numbers prevailed, and he was dragged back snarling, his weapon clattering to the stones. Holmes, calm amid the tumult, guided Clara Whitcomb to the safety of a cab, where I did my best to soothe her trembling nerves. Lestrade, flushed with triumph, secured his prisoner, yet Holmes's expression remained thoughtful rather than satisfied. You have your man, Inspector, he said, but the matter is not ended. This is but the outer veil of the mystery. Ask yourself, what drove Luca to so desperate a scheme? Not passion alone, nor even revenge. There is a deeper design at work, and until we uncover it, we have not solved the case. As the cab bore Miss Whitcomb away toward her father's house, I saw the familiar gleam in Holmes's eyes, the gleam that told me the game was not won, but had only just begun. We returned to Bloomsbury under a starless sky, the fog now thinning only slightly, revealing the outlines of narrow streets and shuttered shop fronts. Holmes remained unusually silent throughout the drive, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cab's window. I, too, felt the weight of the case settle heavily upon my shoulders. For while Clara Whitcomb was safe, the motives and design behind Luca's audacious plot remained obscure. At her father's house, Clara was immediately attended to by her parents and the household staff, the mixture of relief and lingering terror on her face marking the ordeal she had endured. Holmes, however, lingered in the study with Mr. Whitcomb, examining the scene as though he had entered a crime scene anew. He handled the torn lace fragment, laid it alongside the scrap found at Luca's lodgings, and studied the two with meticulous attention. Notice, Mr. Whitcomb, he said, that these pieces are identical in weave and embroidery. But the second fragment bears a faint scent, a perfume unfamiliar to London. That, coupled with the note's wording, suggests a prearranged rendezvous, a plan conceived with the precision of a stage manager. Now, sir, tell me, did you observe any peculiarities among your guests at the wedding? Perhaps a new servant, a stranger lingering at the doors, or even an unusually attentive relation? The father reflected, rubbing his forehead. Now that you mention it, yes. A young woman, ostensibly a distant cousin, offered her services to assist Clara in her dressing. She was very courteous, and I paid her little heed, assuming her to be family. But her manner, Holmes, it was excessively attentive, almost rehearsed. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Ah, that aligns precisely with the method. The impostor must have used this pretense to gain proximity to Miss Whitcomb, perhaps even to exchange garments or confuse the attendants in the vestry. Every detail, no matter how trivial, was exploited. I realized with some discomfort that Holmes's deductions were as inexorable as gravity itself. Then the woman at the altar, the veiled actress, was not the bride merely by chance but by orchestration. Exactly, Watson. And consider this. Luca had to be confident of her skill. He would not employ an amateur for a deception so delicate. Therefore, his selection was intentional and informed. Yet a question remains. What gain did he anticipate? Holmes leaned back, eyes narrowing. Money? Perhaps, though the bride's family is not impoverished. Influence, a threat? Or, more intriguing, the mere satisfaction of a criminal mind taking risk. I ventured that perhaps he wished to force a marriage by coercion, but Holmes shook his head. No, the notes and signs indicate no desire to wed, only to transport. But to transport to what end? This is the deeper question. He does not act in isolation, Watson. Actors, accomplices, and disguises are all necessary. Observe the lace fragment again. The faint scent is a clue. Not Italian in origin, but French. The perfumes imported for theaters. Our conspirators are cosmopolitan, and their network more extensive than a single man. Holmes stood abruptly. I must visit the theater once more to examine the troops' connections and inquire of recent departures from London to French ports. There may be others at work, unseen yet integral to the plan. We spent the remainder of the night tracing shipping manifests and consulting the Argus Theater's register. Holmes cross-referenced the names of performers with passenger lists to Cherbourg and Marseille, noting discrepancies, sudden absences, and missing luggage shipments. It became increasingly clear that the elopement, or rather, the abduction, was facilitated by a network skilled in movement, secrecy, and the use of theatrical means. By dawn, Holmes had pieced together the skeleton of the conspiracy. Luca, aided by a trained actress, had planned to spirit Miss Whitcomb aboard a vessel that would sail under cover of fog. The actress would create confusion, the father's household would be deceived, and the authorities delayed until the fugitives were beyond reach. Yet Holmes's eyes remained contemplative, for some crucial element still eluded him. A detail small enough to be overlooked, yet pivotal in understanding the full scope of the plan. As the first pale rays of sun struck the cobbled streets of Bloomsbury, Holmes turned to me with that quiet intensity which always presaged a revelation. Watson, the mystery is nearly unraveled. But one clue has been neglected, one sign misread. Observe the fragments, the notes, and the costume. It is not merely a question of who acted, but why the timing was orchestrated as it was. And when we discover this final piece, we shall see the design in its entirety. He paused, listening to the muffled bustle of the waking city. Time, Watson, is the one adversary that even the cleverest may underestimate. Luca moves according to the tide, but we can predict his path as the tide predicts the moon. Let us prepare, for by nightfall the veil shall be lifted entirely, and the true intentions behind the bride with two veils will emerge in the open light of reason. In that quiet study, with London awakening beyond the windows, I felt the familiar thrill that always accompanied Holmes's investigations. The first perils had been navigated. The chase was complete in its initial stage, yet the labyrinth remained, winding and obscure. And through it all, Holmes moved with the unerring certainty of a man who sees not only the path before him, but the consequences of every footstep. By mid-afternoon, Holmes and I found ourselves once more at the Argus Theater, this time under the guise of casual inquirers, blending among the milling actors and stagehands. The troupe had begun rehearsals for a matinee, yet our presence drew curious glances. Holmes, however, appeared impervious to notice, moving with the ease of one familiar with crowds and the art of observation. He approached the stage manager, a short, hawk-nosed man who flitted nervously between performers. "Good afternoon, sir," Holmes said, his tone courteous but firm. "I am interested in the attendance records of your company, particularly any departures or absences in the last fortnight. Certain performers, I believe, may have left town suddenly, or may have received instructions from a gentleman named Luca." The man's eyes widened at the name. "Luca, you say? I recall a young Italian gentleman who engaged an actress for a private performance. She was to play a role at a wedding of all things in Westminster. Paid handsomely, too, but I thought nothing of it. Just a favor to a friend." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "And the lady?" She left town immediately afterward, claiming a personal emergency. Left by cab and then, well, we heard no more." The stage manager wrung his hands, evidently aware now that he had unintentionally been complicit in some scheme. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you. That confirms my suspicions. Watson, observe the carelessness with which conspirators conceal their traces. A single missed report, a word to the wrong person, yields the path as surely as a footprint in soft earth. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. The theater had revealed the actor's part in the deception, yet the ultimate aim, the destination of Miss Whitcomb, the rationale for her removal, remained uncertain. Holmes, sensing my tension, placed a reassuring hand upon my shoulder. Let us take the next logical step. Luca has left London, no doubt to secure Miss Whitcomb aboard the Sultana, but the path to the ship is lined with opportunity for interception. I propose we trace the cabmen and lodging houses along the route. A cab is more than wheels and horses. It is a witness, and often an accomplice, if inadvertently so. We departed at once, our pace brisk, canvassing wharves, taverns, and lodgings. Holmes questioned each cabman with subtle skill, noting their reluctance, the way they glanced over shoulders, and their varying recollections of fares. One driver, a wiry man with a thin face, eventually admitted to carrying an Italian gentleman and a veiled woman toward the East Docklands shortly after the wedding hour. The description of the lady's height, her gait, and the tremor in her hands matched that of Miss Whitcomb. Holmes listened intently, occasionally murmuring remarks too low for my comprehension. At last, he stood in the doorway of a dimly lit warehouse, rubbing his chin. Watson, observe the elegance of criminal logic. Luca intended to board the ship unnoticed, yet the very manner in which he conducted his plan leaves evidence in its wake. Timing, routes, and attendance all betray him, if one knows where to look. We ascended a flight of steps to a vantage point overlooking the dock, where the Sultana sat moored, her funnels belching smoke into the sky. Sailors moved about in coordinated chaos, securing ropes and cargo. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The vessel is ready, but the final act has yet to occur. The lady is likely held below, restrained but unharmed for now. Luca's desperation will increase as the hour advances, making him more likely to act rashly. This is when we shall intervene. I shivered, both from the cold river breeze and the apprehension of what lay ahead. Holmes, you believe we can prevent them from sailing? I do, he said calmly. But we must be strategic. A frontal assault would be reckless. We require precision, timing, and the element of surprise. The law will follow me, but I will set the conditions. Remember, Watson, the mind that plans a deception is often the mind that fears being anticipated. We withdrew to a nearby wharf, concealed by stacks of timber and cargo, while Lestrade positioned constables along likely points of entry to the ship. Holmes unfolded a small notebook, sketching the ship's layout and noting the guard rotations. The lower deck, starboard side, contains a small cabin likely occupied by Our Lady. Luca will guard it personally. We shall approach from the opposite side, ascending by rope ladder when the gangway is least observed. Watson, your task will be to support, to restrain panic, and to observe every motion. No sudden action. As twilight deepened, the fog thickened once again, a shroud over the Thames that mirrored the tension in my heart. Holmes checked his watch. We have less than an hour, Watson. Every minute is precious. Observe the sailcloth, the ropes, the shadows. They are as much tools of our success as courage or strength. He cast a brief glance toward the looming silhouette of the Sultana, then back at me with that rare sparkle of anticipation. Tonight, Watson, the third veil will be lifted, and we shall witness not only the end of the deception, but the revelation of the motive that drove it. Remember, all is method, nothing is left to chance. With measured steps, we began the careful approach along the quay, slipping from shadow to shadow, the river whispering beneath us, the ship looming ever larger. The hour was ripe, the stage set, and I sensed, with a combination of dread and exhilaration, that we were on the verge of the decisive moment that would illuminate every secret, every disguise, and every false lead that had brought us to this point. Holmes signaled for me to crouch low behind a stack of crates as he surveyed the gangway leading to the Sultana. Lanterns swung gently in the evening breeze, casting shifting shadows across the deck. The sailors moved methodically, unaware of the drama about to unfold above them. Holmes's gaze rested on a small cabin toward the starboard side, the door slightly ajar, the dim glow of a lantern spilling out in a narrow beam. "That is our location," he whispered. "The lady is confined within, I am certain. Luca will guard her himself, for he fears both the law and the daring of anyone who might intervene. Watson, observe the patrols. 3 on the main deck, 2 along the side. There is a brief interval every 7 minutes when the stairwell is unguarded. That is when we shall move." We advanced silently, stepping carefully along the shadowed quay, until a rope ladder, left coiled by a dockhand, lay within reach. Holmes tested its strength and nodded. "Steady, Watson. Timing and discretion above all. One misstep, and the lady's fate may be sealed before we intervene." The climb was slow and deliberate. Each rung brought us closer to the upper deck and the cabin where Clara Whitcomb waited. Holmes paused at the top, peering cautiously over the rail. Through the narrow slats of the cabin door, I saw her, a figure huddled in the corner, the veil lifted just enough to reveal wide, anxious eyes. Relief washed over me at the sight, though I dared not breathe a word. Holmes's hand on my arm reminded me of the discipline required. Luca, pacing within the cabin, was entirely absorbed in guarding the door, unaware that the shadows themselves had taken form outside. Holmes signaled me to remain motionless, then slipped along the deck to the opposite side, his movements a study in precision. From this vantage, he could observe every action without being observed. I noticed the small trunk that had been loaded with personal effects from the theater and the cab. Luca's eyes flicked repeatedly toward it, confirming my fear that the Italian was obsessed not merely with possession of the lady, but with some larger scheme, perhaps documents or an item of leverage concealed among the trunk's contents. Holmes drew a small device from his coat, a length of cord ending in a weight. "A distraction," he muttered, and with careful aim he let it fall across the deck. The clatter startled a sailor below, drawing Luca momentarily from the cabin door. At that instant, Holmes seized the opportunity, moving with blinding speed to the lock. With a deft twist, the door swung open, and he strode inside. Luca wheeled, dagger in hand, but Holmes was already upon him, twisting the wrist and disarming him in a motion so swift it seemed choreographed. Clara gave a startled gasp, but Holmes's steady voice reassured her. "You are safe, Miss Whitcomb. Remain where you are. Your captor is neutralized." I rushed to her side, keeping watch on the cabin while Holmes secured Luca with a length of rope. The Italian struggled violently at first, but Holmes's grip and Lestrade's timely arrival on deck ensured that resistance was short-lived. The constable seized Luca, binding him securely, while Holmes's sharp eyes surveyed the trunk, now flung open. Inside, we discovered letters, travel documents, and a ledger indicating payments to the actress, as well as notes coordinating timing with the theater troupe and cabmen. Each entry was meticulous, confirming what Holmes had suspected. This was no impulsive elopement, but a premeditated plot orchestrated with careful attention to every detail. Clara stepped forward hesitantly, her hands trembling. I feared they would take me away forever," she whispered. "How did you know where to find me?" Holmes inclined his head, his eyes softening, though the glint of intellect remained ever present. Observing the logic of a plan is often easier than anticipating the folly of men. Each detail, Miss Whitcomb, the note, the fragments of lace, the cab, the theater, guided us. Your captor underestimated the constancy of reason and the power of careful observation. Lestrade, flushed with triumph, took charge of the Italian, marching him toward a waiting boat that would carry him back to Scotland Yard. Holmes, however, lingered on the deck, eyes scanning the darkening river and the fog-laden horizon. "Watson," he said quietly, "the overt danger has passed, yet the puzzle is not entirely complete. We have recovered Miss Whitcomb and apprehended Luca, but the underlying motive, the why, remains. Observe the meticulous records and the selection of accomplices. It speaks not merely to desire or passion, but to the exploitation of a family's trust. There is one more veil to lift, and when we do, the true design will become apparent." Clara, escorted safely below by Lestrade's men, turned once to us, her eyes filled with gratitude. Holmes merely nodded, his attention already focused on the subtle patterns revealed by the captured ledger, the letters, and the calculated movements of a man who had thought himself cleverer than the law. I realized then, with the familiar thrill and awe I have felt so often beside him, that Holmes's mind was already several steps ahead, assembling the mosaic of deceit into a pattern only he could see, preparing to expose it with a clarity that would leave all observers, criminal, constable, and companion alike, in astonishment. The chase, as I knew, was not yet concluded. The revelation of motive and method awaited the final stroke of Holmes's inexorable reasoning. Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in intense scrutiny of the ledger and letters, sitting at a small table in the captain's cabin while the ship rocked gently against the quay. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the dark silhouettes of other vessels tied to the docks, and the faint hum of London beyond the river served only to underscore the quiet intensity within the room. I watched him as he traced lines of writing with his long fingers, eyes narrowing and lips pressing together, noting every discrepancy, every deliberate omission, every nuance that would escape a less disciplined observer. "The pattern is evident," he said at last, his voice measured but electric with anticipation. "Observe, Watson, the dates of payment, the intervals between cab bookings, the synchronized departures. This was orchestrated not merely to remove the lady, but to exploit her presence as leverage. Luca did not act in haste. He acted in calculation, relying upon deception, distraction, and a precise understanding of human expectation." I leaned closer, examining the ledger. "Then the letters and notes were part of the deception, Holmes? The instructions to the actress, the timing, everything was designed to mislead?" "Precisely. They were intended to create the illusion of voluntary elopement, to obscure the true motive, which lies not in passion, but in gain. Observe this entry," he said, tapping the page with his finger. "Payments to the actress coincide with the forwarding of documents to a lawyer in France. The ledger indicates sums transferred on the very day of the wedding. This was a transaction in which the lady was, in effect, the medium of exchange." I felt a chill at the realization. "So Clara Whitcomb was meant to serve as collateral?" Holmes nodded. "She was the instrument, Watson. Luca sought leverage over her family, perhaps to obtain property, influence, or the resolution of some prior grievance. The elaborate masquerade, the use of the theater, the careful timing, all served to disguise a very simple truth, that a clever man was employing audacity to achieve his objective with minimal risk to himself. I could scarcely keep pace with his deductions, for each revelation seemed to cascade from the previous one with flawless inevitability. "And the actress?" I asked. "She was a willing participant, though ignorant of the full plan?" "Exactly so. Her role was crucial but ancillary. The true mastermind depended on her skill to misdirect, and the young lady's compliance was coerced only to the extent necessary to advance the plan. And note this, Watson, the fragments of lace, the scent of foreign perfume, even the choice of cab and lodging, all these details are fingerprints left deliberately, if unconsciously, by those who thought themselves clever." He stood suddenly, pacing the cabin with long measured strides. "We now possess the final pieces. The ledger confirms the dates, the letters confirm the instructions, and the observations of cabmen and theater staff confirm the sequence of movements. Every detail fits the puzzle. The veil of deception is lifted entirely, and the scheme reveals itself in its entirety. A calculated attempt to extract benefit from the misperception of voluntary elopement, executed through the tools of theatricality, timing, and audacity." I watched him, awe mingled with relief. Clara Whitcomb was safe, Luca in custody, and yet the brilliance of Holmes's analysis illuminated facets of the case that none but he could discern. "And the resolution, Holmes? How do we present this to Lestrade, to the family?" Holmes' eyes softened, though his mind remained active. "We present the facts, Watson, with the clarity that only logic affords. We describe the methods, the accomplices, the sequence of events. We expose the motives, reveal the misdirections, and allow the law to follow its course. The triumph lies not in force or confrontation, but in the revelation of the truth. The moment of understanding, when the tangled threads are seen as a coherent whole, is the reward. He picked up the ledger, slipping it carefully into his coat. Come, Watson. We shall descend to the quay, inform Lestrade of the final truths, and escort Miss Whitcomb to her family. But remember, the brilliance of this case lies not merely in capture, but in understanding. Observe always the footprints of intention behind the footprints of action. We emerged onto the deck, the cool night air brushing against our faces. Clara Whitcomb, pale but composed, awaited our guidance, and Lestrade, attentive and slightly flushed from the exertion of earlier efforts, prepared to take Luca aboard his boat for transport back to the yard. Holmes addressed the inspector with that subtle command that carried both authority and reassurance. Inspector, all is accounted for. The woman is unharmed, the villain apprehended, the deception fully revealed. The sequence of events has been verified, motives established, and the misdirections laid bare. You may now proceed with the legal measures that fall within your purview. Lestrade nodded, an expression of relief and awe mingling on his face. Holmes, as always, you leave us bewildered and enlightened in equal measure. But I see now everything fits. The cab, the actress, the ledger, they all tell the story in ways we could scarcely imagine. Holmes inclined his head with quiet satisfaction. Indeed, Inspector. And now, the final pleasure remains, the restoration of order and the gratitude of those wronged. Watson, let us see that Miss Whitcomb returns safely to her family. The law will take care of the rest, but it is reason alone that illuminates the path through deceit. As we escorted Clara toward the waiting cab, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog over the Thames, glinting off the masts of the moored vessels. I observed Holmes's gaze sweeping the horizon, vigilant, methodical, never ceasing, and though the immediate peril had passed, I knew that the intellectual conquest, the unraveling of motive, method, and misdirection was the true triumph. And it was this, as always, that left me both awed and profoundly grateful for the companionship of Sherlock Holmes, the master of deduction and the relentless pursuer of truth. The cab rolled through the awakening streets of London, Clara Whitcomb seated between Holmes and me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes wide with the residual terror of the day's events. Holmes's gaze, however, remained fixed beyond the windows, studying the city with that ever-present intensity, noting the angles of buildings, the faces of pedestrians, the minutiae that might escape any ordinary observer. Lestrade had accompanied Luca, and I was left to consider the extraordinary sequence of events we had witnessed, the audacity of the plot, the theatrical ingenuity, and the methodical unraveling that had made it possible for Holmes to intercept them. You have been most astonishing, Mr. Holmes, I said quietly to him, conscious of keeping Clara's ears unburdened. I scarcely knew where to look, and yet you seemed to see everything at once. Holmes inclined his head modestly, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed the satisfaction of a mind at work. It is not a question of seeing everything at once, Watson, but of understanding the sequence, the motive, and the patterns. Once one grasps the framework, the individual actions reveal themselves with inexorable clarity. Even a labyrinth of deceptions becomes transparent when one comprehends the architecture behind it. Clara, her voice trembling but gaining strength, spoke for the first time since leaving the ship. Mr. Holmes, I do not know how to thank you. You rescued me from a fate I scarcely dared imagine. She paused, glancing at her hands. I feel as though my life has been suspended between two worlds, and yet you have restored it. Holmes regarded her with quiet intensity. Miss Whitcomb, the truth is often veiled, as you have seen. Courage lies not merely in survival, but in clarity of perception. You have endured a deception of rare audacity, and yet you have emerged unscathed because you did not succumb to fear. That is a quality to be commended. I could see the faintest blush on her cheeks, and I suspected that in another hour she would be reflecting not only on the danger she had escaped, but also on the remarkable precision with which Holmes had orchestrated the rescue. It was not merely force or luck, Miss Whitcomb, I added, but an understanding of the patterns of human action. Mr. Holmes's singular gift. The cab slowed as we approached the Whitcomb residence, and the streets seemed to part before us, the fog lifting gradually with the advance of dawn. Holmes instructed the driver to pause, and we stepped onto the pavement. The house, quiet and dignified, awaited us, its doors opening as servants and family members looked on with anxious anticipation. Clara's father, eyes wide and hands outstretched, received her with a mixture of relief and astonishment, and she sank into his embrace, the tension of the morning giving way at last. Holmes remained a few steps back, his attention momentarily distracted by the angles of the building, the pattern of the cobblestones, the alignment of the windows. I realized with a familiar mixture of awe and apprehension that he was still analyzing the environment, still noting details that might prove significant in a later deduction. Once Clara had been safely escorted indoors, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we have intercepted the immediate danger, but the final act remains, the revelation of motive and the exposition of the plan. Luca's ledger, the letters, and the observations we have made form a complete map of intention. The deception was elaborate, but it is not immune to scrutiny. The moment comes when the tapestry of falsehood is unraveled and the connections laid bare for all to comprehend." I nodded, sensing the climax approaching. "Do you intend to explain it to Lestrade? To the family?" Holmes smiled faintly, the shadow of a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Indeed, Watson. Scotland Yard requires the sequence of events to validate the resolution, but the family deserves understanding. The satisfaction of comprehension, of seeing the intricate design behind the chaos, is as important as the apprehension itself. Let us then return to the yard, report our findings, and allow the final pieces to fall into place." As we moved back through the streets toward the police station, Holmes outlined the elements that had gone unnoticed by all but him: the sequence of cab departures, the reliance on theatrical skill, the timing of Luca's movements, and the subtle but decisive signals in the letters and ledger. Each point, he explained, had been a deliberate misdirection designed to mask the true purpose: the extraction of advantage from a family through intimidation and cunning rather than through brute force. By the time we arrived, the light of day had strengthened, casting long shadows along the cobblestones and lending the streets a quiet solemnity. Lestrade received us with a mixture of relief and impatience, eager to record every detail while Holmes prepared to narrate the case in its entirety. The inspector's eyes widened as Holmes described the premeditated sequence, the use of the actress, and the meticulous manipulation of timing and perception that had allowed the abduction to be attempted. Holmes's voice, calm and precise, outlined each element: the false veil at the altar, the hidden passage in the church, the orchestrated cab movements, the selection of accomplices, and the coordination with theatrical performers. He demonstrated, step by step, how every seemingly trivial detail, the lace fragments, the scent of perfume, the letters instructing timing, served to misdirect observers and secure Luca's objective. Lestrade listened, his admiration mingled with frustration at having been outmaneuvered at every stage. While the family of Clara Whitcomb, present to witness the exposition, could at last see the reasoning that had preserved their daughter, Holmes concluded with a brief reflective note, emphasizing that the danger had been averted not by chance, but by the careful application of logic, observation, and foresight. When the narration was complete, a silence fell over the room, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the quiet acknowledgement of those present. Clara's father, voice shaking with gratitude and wonder, extended his hand. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot thank you enough. You have rescued my daughter, revealed the truth, and preserved her dignity in the process. Words cannot suffice." Holmes inclined his head lightly. "It was reason, not heroics, that achieved this result. Observe the connections, the timing, and the patterns, and you will understand that what appears miraculous is often merely the application of method to circumstance." I watched as the inspector and the family absorbed the clarity of Holmes's account, the intricate web of deception finally rendered comprehensible. And though the immediate danger had passed, I knew, as I have often known in the course of our adventures, that the true brilliance lay not in the capture or rescue alone, but in the revelation of design, the laying bare of motive, and the triumph of intellect over artifice. The case of the bride with two veils had reached its denouement. Yet the admiration and astonishment it inspired would linger long in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed it. As the daylight strengthened over London, casting sharp clarity on the streets and buildings, Holmes and I found ourselves once again on the quiet walk back to Baker Street, the evening's events settling around us like a slowly lifting fog. Clara Whitcomb was safely returned to her family. Luca was in custody, and the sequence of deception had been fully unraveled. Yet, as ever, Holmes's mind remained restless, already reviewing each motion, each choice, and each misdirection that had brought us to this denouement. "Watson," he began, his voice low and reflective, "observe the essential lesson in this affair. Every act, however audacious, bears the imprint of intention. The removal of Miss Whitcomb was not a crime of passion, nor a caprice of a moment. It was a plan, intricate and premeditated, executed with audacity and skill. Yet no plan, however clever, can withstand the scrutiny of disciplined observation and logical analysis." I nodded, understanding fully the subtle pride in his tone, though it was tempered by his customary modesty. "It seems almost miraculous, Holmes, how each clue, trivial in itself, combined to reveal the complete picture." "Not miraculous, Watson," he corrected sharply, though not unkindly. "Merely the predictable outcome of careful reasoning applied consistently. The fragment of lace, the scent of foreign perfume, the actress's participation, the cab route, and the timing of Luca's departures, all these were elements forming a chain. Break one and the chain fails, but each link, once noted, led us inexorably to the truth. That is the elegance of method. We passed through the misted streets, the city awakening around us, and I could not resist remarking on the human element of the affair. "And yet, Holmes, do you think Luca anticipated the resilience of the law and the subtlety of your approach? Or did he believe that audacity alone was sufficient to triumph? Holmes's eyes gleamed, sharp and intent. "Audacity can accomplish much, Watson, but only when combined with ignorance of one's observer. Luca was clever, but he failed to account for the constancy of observation and the application of deduction. He left traces in haste, trusted an accomplice too lightly, and assumed the fog of confusion would suffice. In the end, the very audacity that he relied upon betrayed him, as it always does when intellect confronts intellect." I marveled at the clarity of his reasoning, the effortless way in which he traced each motion to its source, each intention to its manifestation. It was as though the city itself, the river, the fog, and the streets had conspired to reveal the truth to him alone, and the rest of us were merely observers catching glimpses of the design. Holmes paused outside a small shop where a flower vendor was setting up her display, and for a moment his expression softened. "Observe, Watson, how ordinary life persists, indifferent to the dramas that unfold. Yet it is in these ordinary spaces, these unnoticed intervals, that the extraordinary may conceal itself. Today we saw how deception can occur in plain sight, and how the most improbable events may be resolved by diligence and insight. I realized then that the case, though concluded in practical terms, continued to resonate in its demonstration of human nature, of the interplay between intention and observation, of the necessity of patience and attention to detail. Holmes, ever alert, seemed already to be cataloging these lessons for future reflection, storing each observation for the next challenge. As we approached Baker Street, Holmes turned toward me, his expression revealing that quiet satisfaction that accompanies the resolution of a complex puzzle. "Watson, the case of the bride with two veils is complete. The immediate danger has been averted, the deception exposed, and the law set upon its proper course. Yet remember, each case leaves a residue, a pattern that may inform the next. We must always be vigilant, for the intellect is the only true safeguard against artifice." I fell silent, contemplating the events of the past hours. Clara Whitcomb, the two veils, the cunning of Luca, the actress's skill, and Holmes's relentless analysis had combined to form a narrative as intricate and precise as any drama played on stage. Yet the satisfaction lay not only in the resolution, but in the understanding, in witnessing the elegant architecture of deceit revealed and dismantled. Holmes entered the doorway of our lodgings first, glancing back briefly with that faint, wry smile. "And now, Watson, we may rest, if only for a short while. There are always more puzzles awaiting, but it is well to savor the clarity of this triumph. Remember, the most perplexing enigmas yield not to force, but to insight, patience, and the disciplined application of reason." As the door closed behind us, I felt a sense of profound admiration mixed with relief. The city continued its rhythm outside, unaware of the drama that had played out along its fog-laden streets. Yet I knew that within the walls of Baker Street, the mind of Sherlock Holmes had once more triumphed, seeing the unseen, understanding the obscure, and revealing, in the end, the truth concealed beneath the veils. And as I settled in my chair beside the fire, I reflected that in this singular case, the intellect had proven mightier than audacity. Reason had prevailed over deception, and the extraordinary power of observation had safeguarded the innocent. In the quiet that followed, the streets of London resumed their ordinary hum, but the lessons of the day, of disguise, timing, and meticulous calculation, would linger in memory, a testament to the inexorable clarity of Sherlock Holmes's method, and the certainty that no matter how complex the deceit, truth would ultimately emerge. Thus ended the remarkable affair of the bride with two veils, a story of audacity, cunning, and intellect, and another demonstration that in the hands of Sherlock Holmes, every puzzle, however intricate, could be unraveled, every secret revealed, and every deception laid bare beneath the unwavering light of reason. The next morning, Baker Street was bathed in pale sunlight that filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the familiar clutter of chemical apparatus, scattered papers, and Holmes's ever-present violin case. The city outside began its measured rhythm, the clatter of carriage wheels, the distant rumble of omnibus horses, and the soft murmur of pedestrians starting their day. But within our rooms a quiet stillness lingered, as though the events of the previous night had left a subtle weight in the air. Holmes sat in his armchair, his chin resting upon one long, elegant hand, while his sharp eyes traced the pattern of shadows across the floor. I, in my usual seat opposite him, was attempting to record the final observations from the case, though my thoughts were distracted by the extraordinary precision with which he had conducted the investigation. Even after all these hours, the clarity of his reasoning, the attention to detail, and the ability to anticipate Luca's every movement continued to impress and humble me. "Watson," he said suddenly, lifting his gaze, "observe the final elements of the case, for they contain the true lesson beneath the spectacle. We have apprehended the criminal, restored the innocent, and revealed the method of the deception. Yet the motive, the why, remains the most instructive aspect. It is here that the character of the man, the use of artifice, and the ingenuity of planning converge to reveal human nature itself." I leaned forward, eager to follow the thread he was about to unravel. "Do you mean to say, Holmes, that there remains a deeper layer to Luca's scheme, something that even the evidence at the docks did not fully disclose?" Holmes inclined his head, steepling his fingers as his mind evidently traced invisible lines through space and time. "Precisely, Watson. The immediate danger was clear: abduction, concealment, potential flight. But the ledger, the letters, and the notes reveal a subtler objective. Luca's true aim was not simply to remove Miss Whitcomb. It was to manipulate perception, to induce confusion, to employ theatricality as leverage over a family and over law itself. The veils, the misdirection, the timing, each was calculated not for effect alone, but as instruments of psychological control. I considered this carefully, recalling the precise moments at Westminster, the cab routes, the hidden passage, and the actress's role. So the deception extended beyond the physical act of taking the lady. It was a psychological construct designed to force a response, to create fear and uncertainty. Holmes nodded, eyes narrowing. "Exactly so. Observe the placement of the fragments. The lace, the perfume, the letters, they are all elements that create a narrative within the narrative. Each misdirection serves to obscure the truth, and yet simultaneously, they are clues for one who knows how to read them. Luca relied upon our lack of insight, upon the conventional expectation of chaos, yet failed to consider the constancy of observation and reasoning. It is a profound illustration of the difference between cleverness and intellect. I marveled at the subtlety of his conclusion. And the actress, her role, though unwittingly aiding the plot, was integral to the construction of this psychological stage. Holmes allowed a faint smile. Yes, Watson. She was the instrument by which misperception was achieved, her skill enhancing the credibility of the ruse. Yet she acted without full knowledge of the motive, and that ignorance, paradoxically, limited the effectiveness of the plan. An accomplice who is too knowing can be a liability. One who is too ignorant can be manipulated. Luca attempted to balance these extremes, and therein lay both the genius and the flaw of his scheme. I felt the intellectual thrill of understanding begin to unfold, each piece of the puzzle settling into place, and in the end, it was your ability to observe minute details, to trace patterns, and to anticipate human behavior that revealed the truth. Holmes inclined his head gravely, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his posture. It is always observation, Watson, coupled with reason. The smallest detail, a smear of perfume, the timing of a cab, the placement of a letter, may be all that is required to unravel the most intricate plot. The key is to see and then to think. Nothing is left to chance, and yet chance itself may provide the clue if one is attentive. I reflected upon the events, the sequence from Westminster to Soho, the theater, and finally the docks. Each movement, each decision by Luca and his accomplices had been observable, predictable to a mind capable of connecting disparate facts. The true triumph lay not merely in capture, but in comprehension, in revealing the intricate weave of action and intention that had hitherto concealed the truth. Holmes rose suddenly, moving to the window and gazing out over the mist-laden streets. Watson, the case concludes with the apprehension of the criminal and the restoration of order, yet its lessons endure. The intellectual victory, the understanding of method, motive, and manipulation is the lasting prize. Observe the elegance of design in what appeared to be mere chaos, and you will appreciate the full scope of human ingenuity, both noble and base. Noble and base. I felt the resonance of his words, the quiet power of reasoning applied without haste, without error, and without sentiment clouding judgment. It is extraordinary, Holmes, I said softly, how a single series of actions can conceal such complex intention and yet yield to meticulous observation. Holmes turned, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and philosophical reflection. Extraordinary, Watson, only because ordinary minds do not pause to observe, to think, to trace the chain from effect back to cause. Once one does, the extraordinary is revealed as natural consequence. The mind that discerns pattern sees where others see only confusion. The morning continued to unfold beyond our windows. The city alive with commerce and chatter, indifferent to the drama of the previous night. Holmes returned to his chair, leaning back with the faintest sigh of completion, and I settled once more at my desk, recording the final observations for posterity. The case of the bride with two veils had tested audacity, deception, and intellect, yet it had also affirmed the power of reasoning and careful attention to detail, qualities that Holmes wielded with unparalleled mastery. As I wrote, Holmes's voice, quiet but incisive, reflected the final thought of the case. Watson, it is not merely the capture of the guilty that defines our work, but the illumination of truth. Where others see only chaos, there is order. Where others see only confusion, there is method. And it is this understanding, the revelation of design beneath the veil, which endures as the triumph of intellect over artifice. And so, in the gentle light of morning, with London resuming its familiar rhythms, the case reached its final resolution, not only in the safety of the innocent and the apprehension of the guilty, but in the enduring lesson that observation, reason, and careful attention can pierce any veil, unravel any deception, and reveal the truth that lies beneath. In that quiet hour, I realized, as I have so often in our adventures, that the marvel of Sherlock Holmes lies not merely in his victories, but in the clarity with which he renders the complex comprehensible, the obscure transparent, and the seemingly impossible entirely within the grasp of reason. And with that, the story of the bride with two veils came to a close, leaving behind admiration, astonishment, and the inexhaustible proof of intellect triumphing over artifice. The afternoon sun slanted across Baker Street, casting long golden shafts into the familiar clutter of Holmes's rooms. Outside, the city pulsed with its customary energy, the rattle of carriage wheels mingling with the soft murmur of pedestrians and the distant clang of factory bells. Inside, however, there was a rare stillness, a pause that allowed the events of the past hours, the abduction, the deception, the rescue, to settle fully in our minds. Holmes remained by the window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the street, as though he could still observe the invisible threads of human action that had brought the case to its resolution. I sat at my desk, pen in hand, attempting to commit to paper the sequence of events, the minute details, and most importantly, the logic that had allowed Holmes to anticipate and intercept Luca's plan. It was a task both rewarding and humbling, for while I had followed him step by step, it was impossible to fully capture the clarity and elegance of his deductions. Holmes's voice, low and deliberate, drew my attention. "Watson, it is essential to understand that the triumph here was not in the physical apprehension alone, but in the intellectual conquest. The abduction itself was merely the surface. The true measure lies in discerning motive, predicting action, and tracing the chain of events to their origin. Observe, if you will, how each seemingly trivial detail, the lace fragment, the scent of imported perfume, the choice of cab routes, the theater accomplice, converged to produce a comprehensible pattern." I inclined my head, tracing in my mind the steps from Westminster to Soho, the theater, and finally, the docks. "It is extraordinary, Holmes, how a mind attuned to observation can turn what appears to be chaos into a sequence of inevitable outcomes." "Extraordinary only to those unaccustomed to method, Watson," he replied. "In truth, it is merely the application of consistent logic. Observe Luca, audacious, clever, and yet his overconfidence betrayed him. He relied on distraction, on theatricality, on the assumption that ordinary observation would suffice for concealment. But the careful mind, trained to notice the seemingly inconsequential, sees the structure hidden within the disorder. That is the key to all such investigations." He moved from the window to the desk, leaning over my notes. "Consider also the psychological dimension, Watson. Luca's design was not purely physical. It was a manipulation of perception. The veiled bride, the false exits, the timing, all intended to mislead observers, to create panic, to obscure his true objective. Yet in each of these misdirections, there existed the latent thread that, once recognized, revealed the complete plan. The extraordinary is often hidden in the ordinary, Watson. One must merely see it." I looked up from my papers, absorbing the full significance of his words. So it was not merely a question of rescuing Miss Whitcomb, but of comprehending the entire architecture of the scheme, the interplay of intention, timing, and human psychology. "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes glinting. "And notice how the accomplice, the actress, was employed. She believed herself part of a harmless theatrical ruse, yet her unwitting participation was instrumental in the orchestration of the deception. This demonstrates a subtle principle. One may manipulate human action without direct coercion, provided the actor is sufficiently skilled and motivated by their own perceptions. Every participant becomes a vector in the chain of causality, yet only those who observe carefully discern the pattern." The lessons of the case pressed upon me, both intellectually and morally. The elaborate construction of the abduction, the use of theatrical skill, and the meticulous timing illustrated not only criminal ingenuity, but also the fragility of human expectation and the power of observation to counteract it. Holmes's mind, as always, had navigated these complexities with precision, extracting clarity from the fog of deception. He paused by the window, watching a child chase a hoop along the cobbled street below. Watson, the ordinary rhythms of life continue, indifferent to the dramas that unfold around it. Yet it is within these ordinary spaces that the extraordinary may conceal itself. Today we have witnessed audacity, cunning, and the application of method. Tomorrow, similar ingenuity may manifest elsewhere, hidden beneath the veil of everyday activity. And so the pursuit of understanding, of observation, of reason, remains ever necessary. I reflected upon the case in its entirety. The wedding at Westminster, the veiled impostor, the hidden passage, the cab journeys, the theater accomplice, the dockside confrontation, and the eventual revelation of motive and method. Each step had been logical, each observation meaningful, each deduction precise. The danger had passed, the innocent restored. The guilty apprehended, yet the intellectual satisfaction of understanding the plan, of seeing the design in its entirety, was perhaps the greatest reward of all. Holmes finally settled back in his chair, the faintest smile touching his lips. Watson, the case of the bride with two veils concludes not merely with safety restored and justice enacted, but with the illumination of human intention, the exposition of method, and the triumph of reason over artifice. Observe how clarity emerges from the fog, how truth pierces deception, how intellect prevails where audacity alone would fail. This is the enduring lesson, the enduring pleasure, and the ultimate triumph. I could not help but feel a profound sense of admiration and gratitude, not only for the safety of Clara Whitcomb and the resolution of the immediate peril, but for the extraordinary demonstration of intellect and observation that Holmes had provided. Holmes, I said quietly, it is not merely the outcome, but the revelation itself, the unfolding of the pattern, that impresses most profoundly. Holmes inclined his head, eyes distant yet focused, as though tracing invisible threads beyond the walls of our rooms. Indeed, Watson, it is understanding that distinguishes the ordinary from the exceptional, the perceptive from the merely observant. Today we have not only rescued the innocent and captured the guilty, but we have unveiled the architecture of deception itself. Remember this, for it is the true measure of mastery in our work. As the sun climbed higher, casting London in a steady light, I felt the weight of reflection settle upon me. The streets beyond continued their ceaseless rhythm, unaware of the drama and intellect that had unfolded among their shadows. Within the quiet of Baker Street, however, the lessons endured. Observation, reason, and method triumph over audacity, deception, and impatience. Holmes, ever vigilant, had once again demonstrated that even the most intricate scheme could be unraveled by intellect guided with precision. The city, indifferent and ongoing, seemed to affirm his words. And as I recorded these final observations, I realized that the case of the bride with two veils would remain not only as a tale of audacity and cunning, but as a testament to the enduring power of insight, to the triumph of logic, and to the extraordinary clarity that comes to those who observe, analyze, and reason without fail. Holmes rose from his chair, moving to the window with that familiar poise, his gaze extending beyond the immediate, beyond the city, perhaps into the very patterns of human behavior that would present themselves in future puzzles. Watson, he said softly, almost to himself, the work continues always. Each case leaves a residue, a lesson, a map for future application. The methods of today illuminate the possibilities of tomorrow. And yet, for now, let us appreciate the completion of this design, the exposure of deception, and the restoration of order. I knew, as I looked upon him, that the fascination and satisfaction of this adventure were complete. Yet in his mind, the wheels were already turning toward the next enigma, the next challenge, the next opportunity for intellect to prevail. The case was concluded, the mystery resolved, but the admiration, the astonishment, and the lessons it provided would endure, as they always did, within the walls of Baker Street and the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly, while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Baker Street, painting the familiar rooms in warm golden light. Holmes sat quietly in his armchair, pipe in hand, eyes fixed on some distant thought beyond the immediate surroundings, while I put the finishing touches on the account of the case, attempting to record the logical tapestry that had led us from Westminster to Soho, from the theater to the docks, and finally to Clara Whitcomb's safe return. Holmes broke the silence at last, his voice calm but edged with the intensity that always accompanied a revelation. "Watson, the final pleasure of this case lies not merely in the apprehension of Luca, nor in the safe restoration of Miss Whitcomb, but in observing the full architecture of intention behind the deception. Let us retrace the steps, for there remains one final exposition to make the matter fully comprehensible." I leaned forward, pen poised. Holmes continued, enumerating each element with his characteristic precision: the initial planting of the veiled impostor, the use of the hidden church passage to mislead the groom and the congregation, the calculated timing of cab departures to obscure the route to Soho, the involvement of the actress as both a misdirection and instrument of leverage, and the meticulous coordination of all movements with the intent of creating confusion while retaining control over every variable. All of these elements, he said, were designed to produce a singular outcome: the manipulation of perception. Luca wished to appear audacious yet inconspicuous, bold yet invisible. He relied upon human assumptions, the natural tendency to see only what one expects, to conceal his true objective, which was not merely abduction, but leverage over the Whitcomb family through the threat of coercion and the illusion of voluntary elopement. I nodded, the clarity of his explanation illuminating the intricate web that had eluded even the most diligent observers at Scotland Yard. And the fragments, the notes, the theater accomplice, they were all tools of that manipulation? Exactly, Watson, Holmes affirmed. Each detail is a deliberate instrument. The fragment of lace suggested a struggle. The scent of imported perfume hinted at foreign involvement. The letters directed timing and action, and the actress provided a credible disguise for the necessary misdirection. Only by tracing the convergence of these clues could one reconstruct the sequence and understand the motive. Holmes leaned back, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of intellectual conquest. The true triumph lies not in the capture itself, but in the illumination of the plan, the revelation of intention. Observe how audacity falters before reason, how deception unravels under scrutiny, and how every misstep, even by a clever man, leaves a mark for those trained to see. That is the lesson and the reward. I could scarcely keep pace with his mind, yet I sensed the profound satisfaction he derived from the resolution. Then the danger was never merely the physical act of abduction, I said. It was the misperception, the manipulation of expectation, that constituted the true threat. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Precisely. And that is why Miss Whitcomb's safety, while paramount, is only part of the narrative. The larger matter, the comprehension of motive and method, provides the lasting understanding. The pattern is revealed, the misdirection exposed, and the intellect triumphs. Observe, Watson. It is in this careful unraveling that the elegance of reasoning becomes evident. For a moment, the room was silent, the city outside continuing its ordinary rhythms, oblivious to the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Holmes's eyes scanned the familiar interior of Baker Street, as though cataloging every detail for the lessons yet to come. The case is complete, Watson. Clara Whitcomb is restored to her family, Luca is in custody, and every misdirection accounted for. Yet remember, the true satisfaction lies not merely in resolution, but in understanding the design, the subtle interplay of actions, and the triumph of intellect over audacity. I sat back, filled with admiration and relief, recognizing the full scope of his achievement. Holmes, I said softly, it is astonishing the way every clue, every observation, and every deduction converge to reveal the truth. The case might have confounded all but the keenest mind. Holmes's faint smile touched his lips, and he waved a hand in dismissal of my praise. It is the application of method, Watson, nothing more. The extraordinary is often nothing but the inevitable conclusion of careful observation, thoughtful reasoning, and the patient tracing of events to their source. And now, let us enjoy the quiet aftermath, for the next puzzle awaits, and the mind must always remain alert. With that, he returned to his chair, lighting his pipe, the faint curl of smoke rising like the remnants of a mystery now fully solved. I reflected upon the entire affair, the veiled bride, the hidden passage, the theater accomplice, the docks, and the final confrontation, and felt, as I always do, the awe-inspiring power of Holmes's intellect. The city continued on, unaware, while within the quiet of Baker Street, the triumph of reason over deception had been decisively affirmed. Thus concluded the remarkable case of the bride with two veils, a tale of audacity, cunning, and the meticulous application of logic, in which observation, foresight, and intellect had prevailed over artifice, and the truth, at last, shone clearly through the carefully constructed veils. Holmes reclined, eyes distant but content, and murmured, almost to himself, "Every mystery, Watson, is but a challenge to perception, a test of reason and a call to the careful mind. Today the veil has been lifted. Tomorrow another awaits, and so we continue, as always, seeking clarity where others see only confusion." I made a final note in my journal, setting down the account of a case that had tested cunning, deception, and human ingenuity alike, and felt a quiet satisfaction that under Holmes's guidance, every shadow had been illuminated, every secret disclosed, and every truth restored. The city beyond carried on. Oblivious, yet within the walls of Baker Street, the lessons endured. That method triumphs over audacity, observation over chaos, and intellect. When applied with precision, is the most formidable force of all.